Hello and welcome to 1 Samuel 29. This is an incredible story, an intriguing story, especially as the subterfuge starts to play out. Over the last couple of days and a week or so, we've been engrossed in the story of how on earth is David going to get out of this bind he's placed himself in. He seemingly has really put himself into a situation where he's going to find it difficult to actually not be part of the war against his own people, of which he has the prophecy to be king. And 1 Samuel 29 occurs in historical detail before the events of 1 Samuel 28 in terms of the Witch of Endor. And this is really to give us the understanding, even before we get to the story of David here in Achish, that the kingship of Saul is doomed. It cannot be rescued by David at all. In a sense, it gives us an outcome of what is going to occur of the actions that even David is speaking about in our text here today. The text begins in a moment in 1 Samuel 29 with David and Achish and all the forces of the Philistines gathering once again at Aphek. And the readings are going to come up, and we'll come back to look at a few things in this amazing part of Scripture. 1 Samuel 29, beginning at verse 1. The Philistines gathered all their forces at Aphek, and Israel camped by the spring in Jezreel. As the Philistine rulers marched with their units of hundreds and thousands, David and his men were marching at the rear with Achish. The commanders of the Philistines asked, "What about these Hebrews?" Achish replied, "Is this not David, who was an officer of Saul, king of Israel? He has already been with me for over a year, and from the day he left Saul until now I have found no fault in him." But the Philistine commanders were angry with Achish and said, "Send the man back, that he may return to the place you assigned him. He must not go with us into battle, or he will turn against us during the fighting. How better could he regain his master's favour than by taking the heads of our own men? Isn't this David they sang about in their dances? Saul has slain his thousands and David his tens of thousands." So Achish called David and said to him, "As surely as the Lord lives, you have been reliable, and I would be pleased to have you serve with me in the army. From the day you came to me until today, I have found no fault in you, but the rulers don't approve of you. Now turn back and go in peace, do nothing to displease the Philistine rulers." "But what have I done?" asked David. "What have you found against your servant from the day I came to you until now? Why can't I go and fight against the enemies of my lord the king?" Achish answered, "I know that you have been as pleasing in my eyes as an angel of God. Nevertheless, the Philistine commanders have said, 'He must not go up with us into battle.' Now get up early, along with your master's servants, who you have come with you, and leave in the morning as soon as it is light." So David and his men got up early in the morning to go back to the land of the Philistines, and the Philistines went up to Jezreel. The choice of place by the Philistines was not an accident. It was where they had their first battle victory recorded in our scriptures in 1 Samuel, way back in 1 Samuel 4. And it was where the Ark of the Covenant was lost to the Philistines for a period of time before it's coming back into the land of Israel. And so it forms a bit of a bookend in terms of our text with the kingship of Samuel and Saul, because Samuel as the prophet and Saul as the king really came into the fore after this time of 1 Samuel 4. And now we get to the end of the story, sadly, with Saul's kingship. And the Philistines chose this because it was where they had this victory that led Israel in the first place to demand a king. And as we get to the Second Battle of Aphek, we know that it's been chosen to bring back those memories to the Philistines that they're going to be victorious. Aphek also allowed, in terms of its geography as a northern part of Israel, a chance for the Philistines to cut off Israel from its northern friends who are also part of the land of Israel. And by cutting them off, they hope to remove the ability for Saul to be, if you like, helped by his northern neighbours, which might explain in a moment David's behaviour as well. So as the Philistines gather and the Israelites gather at Jezreel, there comes an occasion where, just as the battle's about to occur, the commanders of the army, those who probably had been in wars with David over the years, or certainly had heard about them, started to say to themselves, "It is not worth the risk to have this bloke fight on our side, because when push comes to shove, where is this man's allegiance going to be? They don't know David. They have not been with David and Achish, and they say they're not willing to take the risk. And a couple of times through our text today, Achish says phrases which over and above demonstrate the irony of the situation. Irony is the difference between appearance and reality. David has the appearance of being on Achish's side, but actually he's on God's side. And that is amazingly coming out in a couple of sentences in our text today. Previously we had wondered, when the battle heated up, what is David going to do? Well, David has started to show his hand. One suspects that the reason he's at the back of the army line is not just because he's become Achish's own bodyguard, but also because he can form his own pincer movement himself. The aim of the war, if you recall, is to cut off Saul from his northern forces. Well, the most northernest force of the Philistine army is going to be David at this point, and so one suspects that the commanders are saying, wait a minute, this guy cannot come with us. And they even say this, the line that we've heard so often. David they sang about in their dances, verse 5. Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands. So they're worried about a pincer movement with Saul at one end and David at the other. So, verse 6, as surely as the Lord lives, you have been reliable, and I would be pleased to have you serve with me in the army. I have not found any fault in you. Well, that's because he wasn't looking that hard, nor was he really trying to discover the deception of David. David's deception had been so good that he'd made David his bodyguard. But because the Philistine commanders had decided this was not the right ploy, and the weakness of Achish, he agrees to send David back. David pleads his case. He pleads that he is not the man that Achish thinks he is, or is certainly not the man that the Philistines commanders thought he was. But in reality, he is exactly that man, because we are let into a small inkling that David was going to actually kill Achish and kill the Philistines rather than go to war against his own people. And it's in the phrase where David says that he is going to fight for his Lord, the servant, the king. And we know that really that means he's going to fight for his God. And he will not kill the king, will he? He never said he would kill the king of Israel. And so when push came to shove, it seems that David had always intended, in this case, to fight against the Philistines in order to save Israel from the Philistine army. Achish said in verse 9, I know that you have been pleasing in my eyes as an angel of God. Nevertheless, it's time for you to go back. He's completely unaware of the duplicitous nature of David. The commanders, they may have had an inkling or just weren't willing to take the risk. But David was forced to pack up and go home. In other words, the very prophecy that we heard about from the witch of Endor was definitely going to come true, because the only way that Saul could have ever been saved was by a man of God. He himself is not a man of God. Samuel is dead. He's consulting witches. The only person who could have saved Saul was David. David had plans. God had other plans. And the plan for David was not to fight, but to go, and for Saul to lose. Amen.